Now for this demo, I just want to lay out the scenario that we're using. So this is a healthcare project. It's processing hundreds of millions of patients of records at the end of the month. Each patient record has multiple associated treatments with it. The whole purpose of this scenario is that we're making approval decisions. So was this treatment for this patient approved or not? For demo purposes, this is very simplified compared to what you would have in a real world use case, but this is useful for demonstrating the concepts and helping you get started with data access and batch processing in Corticon. So everything I'm going to show is bundled with the product. So the samples I'm going to use, you have access to. If you go into Corticon Studio, into the Samples tab, you'll see each of these samples. There's EDC, ADC, batch, as well as multiple database connectivity, which is sort of an advanced usage of the ADC database connectivity. Now, one of the things that I have done in prep for this is you will need a database because this is all about data access. So I'm using Microsoft SQL Server 2017. I've already created two databases there, patient records and CMS detail. Both of these databases are just empty now, and we're going to populate them with the schema and data that we need for the samples as we go through the demo. All right, so the first sample that I'm going to demonstrate is using Corticon's EDC database connectivity. I call this the easy database connectivity because it's been around for a long time, and it's certainly easier to use than ADC because you don't need to know the SQL. Corticon handles the magic through the object relational mapping that will do. Now, the first thing I need to do to use this sample is to populate my database. So within each of these data samples, you'll see a SQL folder which will have scripts in them for the different databases that you can use the sample with. So I'm using SQL Server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just run this SQL Server script. I've just double clicked on it. This has just opened it up inside of SQL Server, the Management Studio. I'm going to execute this. And what this has done is it has populated my patient records database with the information from our for our use case. We've got the patient data and we've got the treatment data. Very small number of records that were put into each of these. Again, this is for demonstration purposes. I'm now going to come back into Corticon Studio, and I'm going to go to my vocabulary. Now, inside of my vocabulary, you'll see that this data model right here, this mirrors what's in the database. It mirrors what our use case is. This is the domain that we're working with. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import the metadata. What this is going to do is this is importing schema information from the database and then using Corticon's smart matching technology to map your vocabulary to the database. So your patient will map to the patient table, treatment to the treatment table. This is something that can help you get started. You can certainly customize the mappings yourself. Now, for the mappings, if I look at the patient and I look at the properties for this, I'll see that patient, this is mapped to the table right here. It's patient.dbo.patient. So there is a mapping here. Similarly, you'll see it for the fields that within there. Patient ID is mapped to patient ID. You can see the associations. This is the joint expression that's going to be used to form this association between patient and treatment. So in this case, I was able to take advantage fully of the smart mapping, and it just took it did it all for me. Now, I've got my vocabulary mapped to my database. What I want to show you real quick for this is I'll show you the rule sheet that we're using. This is a very simple rule sheet. It's really no complexity in these rules. Again, this is just to support what we're demonstrating here, which is the data access capabilities. And this is basically going to determine approval simply based on the procedure code. So that's all that the rules do. The rule flow for this particular demo is very simple. We're just going to determine the approval, and that's it. That's the only step as part of this rule flow. Now let's go over to the rule test. Now, within Corticon, we have the built-in tester. This allows you to execute your rules as though they were deployed, to see how they would perform. This allows you to see if they're functioning correctly, look for changes in behavior. And it's a great capability in Corticon. It helps you to get your rules right and to validate them. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this test as I'm going to run it with no input data, and I'll explain what these different tabs and the different tests are as we go. So I'm just going to execute this. Now, what's going to happen here is Corticon is going to go. So what's happened is it's built the decision service. It's deployed it to an in-process server. So basically, as part of the testing environment. Now, within the tester, you see there's input data, output, and expected. The expected is what you're expecting to get as output, and what the tester can do is compare the output inspected, and it'll basically fail the test if there's a difference. In this case, for what I'm demonstrating, I don't really care about the expected. Now, what this has shown is you'll see that there were a number of patients that were retrieved in here. Now, I didn't give it any input data, but I got all this patient information. They were processed. You look at the approved records were set, for certain treatments. Some were set to false, some were set to true. All right, so the reason all the data was retrieved, if I go look at my rule sheet, and I'm just going to right click on this patient, you'll see that extend to databases is checked. What this does for when you're using EDC, this tells Corticon to go get all the instances of this from the database. So in this case, I'm getting all the instances of patient from the database. You'll see that over here, I've only got about a dozen or so patients in the database, but they were all retrieved and they were all processed by the rules. If I come back to my rule sheet and I turn this off and I run the same test again, we'll see something very different will happen. So it's got to build and deploy the decision service again. It has run, and you notice there's no output data here. And that's because in the rule sheet, I said, do not extend this to the database. So basically, Corticon did not go and get all the patient information. But now if I run this with a different set of a different test case where I'm actually specifying input data, here I'm passing one patient. And so the one here is just the patient ID. If I run this, you'll see it got this information for just that patient. If I go to the multiple patients tab and runs this, you'll see that I have 3 patients here, and it processed each of the patients. So this is a very important distinction with EDC in that if you tell it to extend to database, it will process all the records that you have in the database. In some cases, that may be what you want to do, but in a lot of cases, it's not. You want to be very selective about, in this case, the patients that I'm processing. And the way I'm specifying this here is I'm passing in a patient ID, and we're going to go and retrieve those patients, and that's what we're going to process. All right, so that was EDC. Well, now I'm going to go give you a very similar demonstration, but I'm going to do this using ADC. And this is the ADC database connectivity. What's different with ADC is that you have control over the SQL that's actually being used. This is real important when you have large data sets that you need to retrieve, and you want to do them in a way that's most efficient. It gives you DBA the control over the query that's being used. It's really valuable when you've got data sets with lots of relations. EDC, as you get complex relations, the performance can degrade. And ADC was really developed to support the batch processing use cases, but it has lots of uses outside of that as well. Now, as with the EDC example, there are some SQL scripts here. I've already created my patient database and populated the schema, so I don't need to do that. But what I'm going to do is run the SQL Server script here to do create the ADC schema. Now, let me get this executing, and then I'll tell you what's actually happening here. So with ADC, you have the ability to define the queries. What's exact query do you want to run to retrieve data? The way we manage those queries is within the database itself. Now, it can be, in this case, I just put them in the patient database, but they don't need to be. They could be in another database. If I come over here and I'm just going to refresh Now what I want to demonstrate is what's really like the new capability in 5.7, which is the batch rule processing. So we have a batch processing sample. You notice that this doesn't have anything in it other than the SQL scripts. And that's really an important thing to know about the batch processing, is that there's nothing unique about the decision services that you create to use them with the batch processor. In this case, I can do the batch processing with any of the previous demos that I've shown. I'm going to do it using the ADC database connectivity, because ADC was really designed for use with batch processing. What I'm going to do to get my database set up for this is I'm going to just put some additional information in my database. So if you think back to the other samples, very small data set, I had about a dozen patient records. This is going to give me about 1,000 patient records in the database, and a handful of treatments for each one. So that's executing, just populating the database. I'm going to come back here to my ADC sample, and I'm going to use this as part of my, to demonstrate the batch processing. So the very first thing I'm going to do is go into my vocabulary, and I'm going to export my data source configuration file. So the data source configuration file is this has the definition, all the connection parameters for your data source. Well, the strategy that we have with decision services is that anything that has sort of external configuration information that you would want to change on deployment. So, for example, you've got a difference between your dev and your production environments. We put into the data source XML file. So that allows the IT group to change, say, the connection parameters or the URL of the database that you're going to access. So I'm going to generate my data source XML file, and I'm also going to generate the EDS file, so basically the compiled form of my decision server. So I'm going to take the rule flow. I'm going to save this for deployment. Just put it right there. That's fine. All right, so this is it. It's going to compile the decision service, generating the EDS file. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to Corticon's web console. This is the web-based management tool. It allows you to manage your Corticon server, monitor, see performance information. What I'm going to do in here, I'm just going to log in, and I'm going to deploy my decision service. All right, so I'm going to add my decision service. So I'm going to go to the EDS file that I had created. So I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to deploy this to the local server. I'm going to pick my EDS file. It is in here. It is procedure approval. I'm going to now specify my database information. So I have to give it the data source configuration file so that it knows basically, this is the connection parameters for my database. And that's all I have to do. So if I save this and I deploy this decision service, I'll show up here just one sec. All right, so here is my new decision services deployed. This is the patient processing decision service. I'm now going to switch over to creating a batch job for this. So I'm going to create a batch configuration. I'm going to come in here and create a new batch configuration, and I'll just call this I'm going to demo all patients. I can select the decision service I'm going to process. So this is patient processing. The database that I want to go to, patient data. And now I can select the query that I want to run. So I'm going to run all patients query. I'm going to save this. Now, when I execute this, so this is a batch job. It's defined what it's going to the data source it's going to run against, the decision service, the query that it's going to use. And I'll execute this, and I'll go back and look at my instance of this decision service. And if I look here, you'll see that there is an execution count. So this has been executed 535 times. This is reflective of the data that we had inside of the database. Now what's happening here is I'm going to go back to my SQL Server management tool, and I'm going to look at what's in the other table that I had called out earlier, but we didn't give any of the details on. So there's a batch read table. This is similar to the ADC tables in that it's going to define the queries. I'm going to just view some of the data in here. You'll see I have two queries defined. One is select patient. One is all patients. We're going to select patient from patient ID from patient. So what this is going to do, the batch controller, so the way the batch processing works is there's a batch controller inside of CC Server, the Corticon server. It's built in there. It's a core capability of the server. When you send it a batch execute request, you're giving it the query that you want to run. In this case, I passed in all patients, so the batch controller is now going to run this query and it's going to chunk through the data. There are properties you can set to configure the size of the chunks that we'll use for accessing the data, but it will retrieve those records out efficiently and then pass them down to the decision service for processing. The batch controller and batch in general doesn't really care what the decision service does. All the batch needs to know is how to go get those seed records to pass to the rules, to the decision service. In this case, what I need is patient records with patient IDs. The decision service will go get all the other information that's needed. I could do this with an EDC decision service, an ADC decision service. If you remember back to when we were demoing those in the tester, we showed the case where they were retrieving all the data from the database, or the cases where they were, in the case where they were retrieving just the patient IDs. You want to set up your batch decision services to be processing something like a patient ID, customer ID, that sort of thing, because that gives you that control over the data set you want to pass in, and then you'll just let the decision service do its thing and process the records as it needs to be done. I'm going to come back to the web console again, and I'm going to go and create another batch job. So I'm going to call this demo patients by region. I'm going to select my decision service, same one, patient processing, same data source, but I'm going to pick a different query now. I'm going to do patients by region. What this is doing is it's going to allow me to fill in parameters for the query. So basically variables that are in there. If I look at my query here for patient by region, using the same syntax that we had with the curly braces for the ADC queries, there are tokens that I can substitute in here. So I'm going to select just patients by region. In this case, I'll do just the Northeast region. I'll save that. Oh, I got to put my so basic properties. I've got my batch configuration. I can save this. I can execute this, and that is off and running. If I would go look at my decision surface again, we'll see there'll be more executions for this. You'll see the execution count has gone up. I've processed more patient records, or I've just reprocessed the same records again. So that's really the core of the demo here for the batch processing. You can define your batch jobs. You can execute them. I'm showing the demoing, executing this through the Corticon web console. There is a REST API. You can use the REST API so you can integrate this with other tools that you have, other processes that you have that want to trigger the batch jobs. But the batch processing is great. It'll work with EDC or ADC, but it's really best suited for ADC, and that's because of ADC's advantages over EDC in terms of how it can efficiently retrieve large data sets and handle with a large number of associations while minimizing the number of queries to the database. And the performance difference is significant between them.